Citizens, today I come to you with an important message. Is This Tomorrow is published for one purpose: to make you think, to make you more alert to the menace of communism. Today, there are approximately 85,000 official members of the Communist Party in the United States. There are hundreds of additional members whose names are not carried on the party rolls because, acting as disciplined fifth columnists of the Kremlin, they have wormed their way into key positions in government offices, trade unions, and other positions of public trust. Communists themselves claim that for every official party member, there are 10 others ready, willing, and able to do the party's bidding. These people are working day and night, laying the groundwork to overthrow your government. The average American is prone to say, "It can't happen here." Millions of people in other countries used to say the same thing. Today they are dead or living in communist slavery. It must not happen here.
Hello and welcome, comrades. Is This Tomorrow was published by the Catechetical Guild was published by the Catechetical Guild Educational Society in 1947. That's a mouthful. This was a small press operation that, surprisingly, printed a number of comics throughout the 40s and 50s. Unsurprisingly, all were about Catholic topics and ideals. Their catalog included such titles as The Commandments of God, Teach Ye All Nations, and my personal favorite, Can 6,000 Nuns Be Wrong? The main area of distribution for these comics appears to have been to churches or related facilities, with limited or no newsstand distribution. So, for the most part, the majority of their publishing output is highly obscure and hard to find. However, Is This Tomorrow apparently had widespread newsstand distribution, and reportedly, it sold millions of copies. Even though actual sales numbers aren't available, it's not difficult to believe it was popular at the time and sold well. What I like is the lack of punctuation in the title. It's formed as a question, but there's no question mark to make the title grammatically correct. So it was a poorly executed attempt to make the title a statement. By implication, the events depicted aren't a possibility, they are inevitable unless immediate action is taken. One might wonder, why would a church group be so involved with stamping out communism? In basic terms, communism is not friendly to religion. And there's the classic quote from the German philosopher Karl Marx, published in 1843, but popularized in the 1930s. Quote, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the masses." Unquote. Marx's critique of organized religion and how it oppressed the common man became a part of communism. In 1924, when Joseph Stalin came to power in Russia, this would be enforced, leading to something known as state atheism. So it's easy to understand why a religious organization would be rather concerned about communism becoming popular. It kind of ruins their business model. By the way, if communism is a concern of yours, why not support capitalism by signing up for the Strange Brain Parts Patreon? The plot is surprisingly dense, but it goes exactly as one might expect from a piece of propaganda. Communist members infiltrate and control all unions, and gain influence over left-leaning government officials. Of course, the newspapers have also become a mouthpiece for communist ideals. Social unrest is provoked when a drought happens, and there is a food shortage. As a weird side note, I was going to point out the misspelling of drought, but it turns out, unintentional rhyme, this is an uncommon version of the word. Go figure. End of weird side note. The social unrest contains some casual racism and anti-Semitism, which is kind of hard to miss. But it stays on target and doesn't go too deep into those areas. Nor does it use, let's call it, more inflammatory language to make its point. So I guess that's something positive. Additionally, it reinforces a lot of anti-union sentiments, like constantly. Any strike, regardless of the grievance, and none are provided, is entirely manufactured by communists to cause turmoil. Curiously, and it's an almost subtle point, the US military gets a free pass. Sure, there's infiltration, but the military is not under communist control. It's saying, there's no way we're going to criticize the brave people that fought in World War II. All things considered, a pretty wise move, considering the war had ended very recently. All of this leads to a presidential assassination, and one of the communist-controlled government officials coming to power. With the new president in place, more unrest is created, until the government has to seize more and more power to keep things in control. Anyone who criticizes the new policies are arrested as traitors. Unless they're a church official, then they're killed outright. Honestly, even though it's a conspiracy theory, and it involves some pretty random, beneficial things happening, mostly perpetrated by undeveloped strawmen, it's pretty solid as a plan. There's even an old-fashioned book burning, with the Bible highlighted as the main attraction. It doesn't get burned though. Ironically, it's used as a defensive weapon. As a metaphor to reinforce religious beliefs, I have to say, that's pretty well done. Briefly, chaos ensues as communism takes over America. Of course, there is a particular focus on churches being destroyed or taken over by the state, and the disciples are stripped of their clothing and belongings and forced to find other pursuits. As if addressing the opiate of the masses quote, there's a brief insert that states religion teaches individuality, not unthinking adherence to certain principles. It shouldn't be surprising that a piece of work put out by a religious organization throws out a lot of messaging that's meant to reinforce how great it is. For the most part, religious faith is the protagonist of this piece. It's one set of allegedly good ideals versus another set of allegedly evil ideals. The comic doesn't really have an ending. It comes to a stop when America is fully under communist control, and the mastermind of the operation suddenly drops dead. It's a non sequitur, but perhaps a higher power stepped in to enforce a little justice. Who knows? Overall, for something that has an obvious agenda, it does have a layer of subtle messaging. Or to use a modern term, the dog whistles are frequent and varied. The obvious bits are the clearly evil communists taking advantage of the downtrodden and then subjugating them. The more subtle bits are the various pieces of artwork and text that reinforce how the church protects your freedoms and respects your individuality. You can draw your own conclusions about the possible irony that may or may not be involved. My point is, for something that looks like a cheaply produced piece of propaganda, some actual thought went into how it would deliver its message. And, as an unintended, subconscious admission, the predominance of yellow on the cover does evoke the phrase, yellow journalism. It is, after all, sensationalized and factually fluid, which is a defining feature of a moral panic. Is This Tomorrow wasn't the only anti-communist comic they printed. They also produced The Red Iceberg in 1960. One might note that This Is Tomorrow was published in 1947. It was a warning that America was on the verge of collapsing into communism. 13 years later, when The Red Iceberg was published, communism still hadn't overrun America. It hadn't even come close. Which might indicate communism was not as powerful and effective as implied. Or logically, maybe this comic actually contributed to defeating that political movement. I mean, I have my doubts, but it is an objective possibility. By 1960, the Red Scare had run its course. Some of the more vocal politicians were censured and discredited as opportunistic. Like with many moral panics, the hysteria passed and rationality eventually returned. By the time this sequel was produced, it was already out of touch and didn't reflect any real, ongoing concerns. For those wondering, yes, you can transpose the basics of the Red Scare onto other, more modern moral panics and get similar results. For anyone looking for historic patterns, the Red Scare and the Anti-Comics Crusade, which happened at the same time, are good blueprints for manufacturing a conspiracy that doesn't exist. During those times, fears are materialized as irrational concerns. Perception and opinion becomes infinitely more important than fact, and one feels morally obligated to protect whatever is presumed to be at risk, even though that risk is either minimal or non-existent. Finally, there's never a shortage of devious individuals who capitalize on creating opportunities with those fears. Usually the end result is to separate you from the money in your account.
So be wary, citizens. Be wary of people who tell you exactly what you want to hear, and pretend they're not cultivating your subservient adherence to their fear-based agenda.
Thank you for watching. If you haven't already, give this video a like, leave a comment, and subscribe. If you can support the channel, please do. I cannot emphasize that enough. With that said, thanks to all my fine supporters on YouTube and Patreon. Your contributions are very appreciated. Thank you so very, very much. You make it possible for this channel to limp along in its current state. Extra special thanks to Constant Disappointment Records, Jeff Nicholson, Sicken, Francis de la Cruz, John Nyukes, Andrew Barton, Odin Ashcroft, Ruby St. Denis, Phil Sagan, Edward Clayton Andrews, Corey Drew, L.S. Gregor, Alexa Zernish, Brian Deaton, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient.